Welcome to Sustainability Talks here on Business Talk, brought to you by RMB. And today we're talking about carbon credits and carbon markets, which really sit at this uncomfortable intersection when we talk about sustainability. On the one hand, they promise the ability to decarbonize the world and help us achieve our nationally determined contributions that most countries on Earth signed up to under Paris. On the other, some have criticized carbon markets of using greenwashing and creative accounting and maybe absolving certain actors of taking action faster. So today we're going to ask some of those uncomfortable questions. Where is it heading? What is the big opportunity, and how do we avoid some of the greenwashing that we have seen out there? And it's a great pleasure to welcome Toby Campbell-Colquhoun, firstly, who is head of carbon markets at RMB. Toby, thanks so much for joining us. Great to have you in the studio here. And you joined as well by Franz Renzel, who's MD of Anthesis Group, which is one of the groups at the coalface, pun intended, of this particular market. So, Franz, great to have you join us as well. Maybe I think the obvious question to start with, Toby, is why put a price on carbon? What are we trying to do at a very high fundamental level with carbon pricing?
Yeah, I mean, this is what it all comes down to, indeed. And can I have permission to take you on a brief history lesson?
Please do.
Successful. So if we look at the advent of carbon pricing, this was coming about when I first got involved in the markets around 25 years ago. And the principle back then was saying, okay, carbon is not a local pollutant, it's a global pollutant. And therefore, if you can put in place mechanisms which put a price on carbon, it doesn't matter where in the world those reductions take place, as long as the reductions do take place. And so where we can create markets, you can create incentives whereby companies for whom it is expensive to reduce carbon internally can actually pay other companies for whom it is cheaper to reduce carbon, and thereby still meeting carbon targets, but in a more economically efficient way across a global or local or regional economy.
Right, because you've got a global budget of carbon that we can emit if you want to remain below 2 or 1.5 degrees. Doesn't matter where it happens. So if you can shift that out efficiently, that sounds like a really sensible idea.
Exactly. And on the back of this, there have been a number of governments, both those, so whether it's regional or national or even international, following on from, signals within the UN, putting in place carbon prices under what we call compliance schemes. So these are sort of mandatory pricing, whether it's through a tax or through a cap on emissions on industrial sectors. The most famous of which is the EU emissions trading scheme, going since 2005. And within their industrial sector, seeing about a 50% reduction as a consequence of targets that have been put in place. Now, today, we see about 80 different prices or carbon prices under compliance schemes around the world. Again, these are where there are mandatory targets on combustion emissions, on industrial emissions, where the price or the cap can be ratcheted in such a way that it drives behavior amongst emitting entities.
So it's not standardized, just for the layperson watching who might be very unfamiliar with the market. How does carbon pricing work then effectively if you're not saying, well, there's a global exchange, for example, for gold, it just went through $5,000 an ounce. It's not different in South Africa to the US, for example. How is carbon pricing set around the world?
So it'll be a function of effectively the cap that's placed within each scheme. So we see some schemes such as Europe, you take that as an example, whereby the cap was placed at quite a high level. So there's quite a large cap initially, and then each year it ratcheted down. And what this did was set you started to understand what the marginal abatement cost might be, what we say, so that what it costs to reduce the next ton within the scheme, as companies make decisions of, do I buy or do I reduce? And then within other schemes, such as South Africa, there will be a specific tax that is set per ton of industrial emissions, and that tax increases year on year. And again, that gives signals to companies that have the choice of paying the tax or potentially purchasing a carbon credit to offset that tax. But the point you're saying is, why is there not one global price? And as a carbon purist going back 25 years, I came out of university believing there would hopefully be one global price, but that's not the way that it works, because each one is defined by the specific targets that are set within each specific scheme. So you can have a very wide variety of prices between different schemes, and a lot of the schemes don't link. So you can't buy a carbon credit, a carbon allowance in Europe and use that to offset in South Africa at the moment. But things are looking to change on that front in the coming years.
That interoperability, I think, is key as the market matures and develops. Maybe on that point, France, you could just talk us through the global regulatory landscape and what it's currently looking like when it comes to carbon markets.
Okay, yeah, sure. Just to build on a bit more from what Toby was saying. So basically, if we go back in time, we had the European Emissions Trading Scheme, which is probably the biggest scheme we had in the world. And added onto that, we had the Clean Development Mechanism. And that was the first opportunity back in 2007, 2008, where the developing world had opportunities to receive carbon finance flows into the country and into the projects. So that was sort of like the first time carbon offsetting was used.
Right.
And since then, that has just grown steadily. So even though the clean development mechanism has come to an end, we have seen in its place the global voluntary carbon market has continued to grow, in addition to various compliance schemes around the world. So basically, in South Africa, we have our carbon tax scheme, which is quite large, and then we also do have a small but growing voluntary carbon market in South Africa. So we've got various corporates, banks, can also be multinationals who are buying carbon credits towards their net zero targets. And then in addition, we have the large emitters who are buying carbon credits to pay less carbon tax. So we have a combination of that in South Africa. But the compliance market is the much bigger market in South Africa.
How do they differ then when you're talking about a compliance market versus a voluntary market, France?
Yeah. In South Africa, for example, so a compliance market generally is governed by rules and regulations set by a government, and companies have to adhere to those rules. So in South Africa, it's the carbon tax. There's a Carbon Tax Act of 2019. Companies have to report on the emissions, and if they're above a certain threshold, they have to pay carbon tax. In South Africa, companies are taxed on their Scope 1 emissions, and they can use carbon offsets to pay less carbon tax. And what makes the scheme so interesting is that we do know what the demand is on companies, and we do know where the carbon price is sitting out to 2030. So basically, we have there's a very large opportunity to have more carbon credit projects in South Africa. So we estimate the market is about, if you're looking about 12 million tons per year in demand for carbon credits. Until 2030, you're looking at about easily 30 million tons, 40, 50 million tons. And if you're putting an average price of 300 Rand per ton on that, you're looking about an 18 billion Rand market between now and 2030. There's just phase 2 of the carbon tax, which is quite substantial. So there is some supply available in the market, probably 2 million tons a year, but there's a massive gap. And so just imagine if we deploy that money, that's money sitting there waiting to be used. We deploy that into the economy. We can really create big impact in terms of, with carbon projects.
Yeah. Let's come back a little bit and maybe just define what a carbon credit is and how that then works within the broader voluntary and compliance market, Toby.
Sure. So a carbon credit is essentially generated when you can take an existing project or existing situation and say, here's what the baseline emissions would be in a business as usual scenario. Right. And as a consequence of our project, we have reduced emissions below that business as usual baseline. We can quantify and calculate that, have it validated and verified by a third party. And that can then, in terms of that quantity, we can then demonstrate, okay, we can effectively get that approved with a particular standard. So the two most famous standards which are usable within South Africa are the gold standard and Vera. And as a consequence of demonstrating this, Vera or gold standard will issue a carbon credit, and one carbon credit's worth 1 ton. It sits on a digital registry. Each one has its own unique serial number, so you can see which project, which country, which vintage it came from, and it will sit on either the Vera or the gold standard registry, for example. Those carbon credits can then be transferred a bit like an online banking account at the click of a button. So you can select issued carbon credits, and you can transfer them to a buyer or an end user, who will then determine whether to sell them on or to retire them to meet their own targets.
That's very interesting because what happens once you purchase that carbon credit, you can use that to offset your own, or you can on-sell them because they have some kind of economic value. And then if I'm, say, a SAPI, for example, and I've now built some renewable power at a mill, and I'm reducing my carbon as a result of that, I can then claim those credits to offset the cost of developing that project in a very simplistic way.
Indeed. On the caveat that it must meet the standards that are set by Gold Standard or yeah.
And those standards, are they internationally interoperable, or do they differ by jurisdiction?
Actually, they are international standards. So, if you have a particular project which you are looking to submit and get registered with, for example, Vera, then that can be in pretty much any jurisdiction around the world. But you will need to engage with the host country in order to ensure that there are any necessary approvals, especially for future proofing, when there may be a link between what is happening in carbon credits created in the voluntary market and what can be used under international compliance markets.
Again, and that's where we have this relationship between your voluntary and your compliance markets. Frans, back to you. You said the compliance market opportunity here in South Africa, thanks to the carbon tax, is quite large. Maybe you could just take me through the development of the carbon tax and how this has created this opportunity for our local carbon market.
So when the carbon tax was being formulated back in 2015, 2016, National Treasury always had the idea that because it also was globally done, also under the Clean Development Mechanism, to give companies in South Africa the opportunity to purchase carbon credits which are priced lower than the tax, as a sort of like an easy way to transition into a tax, which is why we also have these various allowances in the tax. So the effective tax rate is much lower than what the headline tax rate is. So it was used as another mechanism to assist companies in the process of decarbonizing. So that's why they've built it in, and they developed regulations to state which type of projects would be eligible as a carbon credit project in South Africa under the carbon tax, which is by and large some of the newer renewable energy projects. It can be a soil carbon project like regenerative farming. It can be cook stoves, etc., etc. So there are many different projects that could be eligible.
Interesting you mentioned cook stoves. I was reading an article from the World Bank towards the back end of last year on just the opportunity set in clean cooking, Toby, for example. I wasn't aware 2 billion people in the world, many of them in sub-Saharan Africa, still use coal and these kinds of fossil-based cooking fuels. And so there's a big opportunity here. We often think of, or hard to abate industries like iron and steel, but this is just kind of mass market stuff that the carbon credit markets helps address.
You're right, and this is where carbon market extends beyond carbon. So this is where there are, if you look at that example of clean cooking, there are traditional cook stove methods using charcoal, which have existed for generations, but which have huge health impacts on households which use the charcoal burners. It has impacts on, gender equality in terms of the amount of time taken to collect firewood, the like in more rural areas. But the solutions can be relatively simple, such as putting in place a more efficient cook stove or replacing with, bioethanol, or with electricity, or with LPG. But the cost per cook stove to a household at the lower end of the economy is too high. So even though the solution is there, they can't afford to buy the cook stove and have the solution put in place. But what companies are able to do is to put in place projects that will demonstrate that by displacing the charcoal or the firewood, you might be reducing deforestation, and certainly replacing the actual fossil fuel emissions embedded within that, or the fuel within that. And you can demonstrate the carbon savings, have that registered, validated, verified, create carbon credits which can be sold, and that money can be used to subsidize the sale of the cook stove up front. And so therefore that allows the supply chain of cook stoves to be manufactured, delivered, transported, for fuel to come in as a consequence of the carbon project. And so this is seeing this in action is makes us quite proud when you see the actual benefits of carbon pricing flowing through. And I suppose this is where the elements of carbon finance also come in, because in those situations, the cook stove needs to be sold, but it may be a number of years before a carbon credit is created from that cook stove. And so through financing, if you're in a market where you have buyers for those carbon credits, or you have sight of what the price might be for those carbon credits, then from a financing perspective, it helps to provide that upfront finance, which enables the project to be implemented, enables the cook stoves to be made, distributed, and then for the carbon benefits to be delivered. So that's how it all intersects.
It's really innovative, but I'm sure you're not going to get too many South Africans stopping their weekend braais with wood and charcoal to offset with carbon credits. But and a really great example, I think, of just how often we think of these things having to be very high tech solutions. Very often they're low tech. They're available, but it's about connecting the markets to the demand.
Right. Another example I also want to bring up is a few years ago we started a regenerative farming project, and currently we have about 40 farmers, some in the Eastern Cape, dairy farmers, and then KZN. And again, it's sort of like going back to basics in a way. What they're doing is they really are farming in a way that's really building soil health. And they, for example, no-till agriculture, cover cropping, reduced fertilizer use, etc. And all of these different interventions they're doing in different parts of their farm is really improving the soil. And if you have a healthy soil, you obviously have more plants and the roots going into the soil, which draws down carbon from the atmosphere into the soil. And that's why we call those kind of carbon credits a removal credit, because it's removing carbon. Something like a cook stove is an avoidance. So you're avoiding emissions being emitted. And it was really, really lovely to see how that all worked in practice, that carbon finance was a way to reward farmers for the practice they're doing. Because in South Africa, there are no subsidies available to farmers when they want to go into regenerative farming. For example, in Australia, they get per year 10,000 Australian dollars subsidy to get a consultant onto the farm and to advise farmers on how to farm better. We don't have that in South Africa, but that's where carbon finance can help. It can come into to help farmers.
Well, I've certainly seen a lot of almost pre-competitive collaboration in this space, Toby. But when we look at verifying these projects and verifying the carbon credit, that seems to me to be maybe slightly trickier than what it may seem on the surface, because to go in and to actually measure impacts over a long period of time, what are the challenges that exist in verifying carbon credits currently?
Yeah, and I mean, this is the science behind the reductions, the avoidance, the removals is indeed an evolving space as we gather information. So, for example, in some projects which involve land use change, do we have the data to show what the baseline emissions are, what the original behavior was, how many soil samples do we have from however many years ago? The processes that are in place are that each standard will have an accredited list of verifiers. So third-party entities which can come in and look at the documents that are put together by a project developer to demonstrate what the baseline would have been and what the emissions reduction levels are. And in fact, each project will have its own methodology. So there will be a specific methodology for certain types of cook stoves, specific methodology for the project that Franz was talking about. And each one of these methodologies undergoes a large amount of scrutiny. It's publicly available for comment. It has to be approved by, again, third parties before the standard itself will approve and allow that project to be registered. So there's a robust process behind this, but it has been evolving over the years as the science has been updated.
Yeah. France, I mean, the robustness and the rigor, I mean, is definitely, I mean, I've been in the carbon market since back in the CDM days, the mid 2000s. And in this market, we're sitting our carbon market 2.0, it is a lot more rigorous. So in this soil carbon project we're doing, we worked on it for about 4.5 years, and we sunk about 3 million euros into it to get to where we are now. And last year, March, we finally got issuance. There is a lot of scrutiny on the project, especially like a soil carbon project or land-based project, nature-based projects. it's the science is tricky. You have to do modeling. The auditors scrutinize it, Vera scrutinize it. So it's definitely, if someone is buying these credits, they can certainly have a rest assured that, the science has got into it, the rigor, the third party checks. So it's not, I would imagine some people might think, oh, it's a fly by night thing or whatever, but it's, it's really solid what's going on.
I would imagine that that complexity does raise the cost a little, because you can't cut corners here, and you've got to be really rigorous around the methodology that you can use.
And indeed, and on top of that, Vera keeps releasing, for example, new versions to the methodology because the science has gotten better or there's been more stakeholder consultation on it. So when you're used to the one version, you already have to look at upgrading it. And that also comes at a cost.
Wow. Toby, can what we're talking about here in the carbon credit and trading environment, can it drive true emissions reduction? Or is it just something of a stopgap that we've needed while technology catches up to this pressing need to decarbonize in various industries and to reduce our emissions? What do you see its role as ultimately?
So in terms of compliance markets where you see a price being put on carbon, that does drive emissions reductions. We've seen the trajectories coming down in a number of compliance markets across the world. It does depend on what level the price is set at or what level the cap is set at. That will drive it. So we would like to see a world where under the UN, we will increasingly see relationships, bilateral relationships between countries, which allows one country to fund emissions reductions in another and drive real change. And again, that depends on the national targets that have been set, and are they ambitious? And bilateral agreements tend to have that embedded in there, where the buying country will say there has to be an ambitious target in the host country of any projects. We do believe that carbon pricing is essential part. It's not the only part, but it's an essential part of driving towards a low carbon future.
Yeah, and a very market-based initiative, and one in France that has evolved. I mean, how do you see it evolving further from here so that it isn't just the stopgap and drives that overall reduction in emissions that we're targeting?
Carbon credits, it allows companies to take action now. Because a lot of companies set themselves targets and say, okay, we want to reduce emissions by X% by 2030, 2040. But in the meantime, they're still emitting. So carbon credits allows you to take action now and account for your residual emissions while you're on that downward trajectory. So if you're on the correct trajectory, let's say as a company, every year you should be emitting slightly less. And then, your share of offsets that you need will also become less. So that should be the trajectory. So, and carbon credits is one tool that's available to companies to use in their climate change toolbox. So that's the most important thing. So that's the thing that companies can do now.
Can I add something to that? Which is, in South Africa is a very good example because there's a carbon tax. It sets a kind of known price. It harmonizes the price of carbon within South Africa, even though the carbon offsets are created from a variety of different projects. If we look at the voluntary market, projects with different methodologies may have different prices, and also unclear. There may be individual buyers, but developing a secondary market, it's quite fragmented. It's illiquid, and that means in terms of developing a forward curve, it's again not delivering a price signal. So for a company that wants to invest in projects or support finance, it makes it a bit tricky. But if you look in South Africa, where there is a clear future pathway on pricing, there is a clear pathway in terms of who consumes the carbon credits. It creates a harmonized price and enables companies to actually finance and invest in projects much more effectively. And so you will see some project developers around the world looking where to deploy, or investors looking where to deploy their capital will look at South Africa and say, we want to put money into projects there if it's a choice between South Africa or somewhere else, because there's a known market, there's a known off-takers, there's a known price signal. So we see that behavior in the market.
And great example of regulatory certainty. I know in South Africa we like to complain about the lack of regulatory certainty in certain sectors, but this is one sector we can look at and say, well, here we've had that price signal, we've had that certainty through government policy, through the carbon tax. What we've seen through to 2030 and beyond can create that kind of confidence. Where do we go to beyond 2030? Let's gaze into our crystal balls a little bit here, gents. France, I don't know if
Yeah.
you want to pick up that first.
Yeah, so in terms of the local carbon market, we do need clarity what's happening after 2030.
Yeah.
It's in all likelihood the pricing of carbon will continue in the economy. We don't foresee that would be scrapped. And on top of the carbon tax rate has to increase more beyond 2030, and the allowances have to be reduced more. So, but of course, you need to balance that in terms of you don't want to shock the economy. But we have seen in the past that there are various emitters, very large companies that have been, kicking the can further down the road instead of seeing how can they make change now and not just push it further, 5, 10, 15 years from now. So that's where we need to see. So it's a robust market until 2030, but beyond that, there's a number of things that need to be made clearer so that more confidence is placed in the market and more money can flow into the market for longer term development. Because some of these projects like cook stoves and also regenerative farm, these are long horizons, and companies like ours, as a project developer, you put a lot of money into it up front, and you need to see that longer term horizon. It can't just end by 2030. Yeah, that makes it a bit of a challenge.
Toby, how do you see it evolving, and are there any innovations perhaps that we might see coming down the line?
A lot of the focus is on what's going to happen under future UN markets. So to what extent are you going to have different countries setting in place these sort of bilateral agreements, enabling a more global market to be created where there may be fungibility in the price of a carbon credit between different schemes. And so that's what I would like to see more of, is an increased linkage between different schemes. But yeah, we've talked about that for a long time. But the UN is starting to set the platform to enable that to actually happen.
Well, hopefully we can, certainly with the leadership that we've seen in the wake of the US withdrawing from some of its Paris, or most of its Paris commitments, I should say, it's been encouraging to see the amount of corporate leadership we've seen, companies going ahead and say, well, if the US wants to go alone, we're still going in this direction. And bilateral between the likes of ourselves, that we were here of the G20, leading the conversation at the G20 and with our partners in the EU as well. Toby Candle, Cole Hoon of RMB, thank you very much. France Rental of Santis, thank you very much for sharing all the more about credits and carbon markets. Fascinating and really wonderful to see that there's this opportunity to help the likes of small-scale farmers, regenerative farming, and decarbonizing our cooking methods as well, amongst so many others that exist in the space. Thanks so much for your time. You've been watching Sustainability Talks here on businesstech.co.za. From me, Michael Avery. Take care.